more here in a minute. But for those of you who are familiar with things like this, the majority of the projects are in places like the Netherlands where it started. And there's a couple reasons I chose England, because the cycling culture in the Netherlands is dramatically different than that of the U.S., whereas the cycling culture in England is much more similar to that in the U.S. And when I was starting this research, there were no shared space projects that I could look at in the U.S., and interest is growing. But that's why I went to England, besides all the other additional hoops I would have to jump through to work in the Netherlands, where English isn't officially their first language, right, to get peer, IRB approval and things like that. So this is a slide behind of one of my sites, one of the entryways to one of my sites up in Poynton, and you can see they sign it. New road layout, pedestrians and vehicles have equal priority. This is the entry feature to give you an idea of what leads into shared space. So I'm going to talk just briefly. I'm going to start with some definitions, shared space, and a few other research relevant definitions, and then touch on the literature. And then some of my research questions, hypotheses, and of course some of the basic assumptions I made and what I was doing. And then how I did it, why I did it, and what I found, and then I'll finish with some general practical ideas and some thoughts with respect to doing projects like this in the U.S. or in general. Like I said, some of you may already be familiar with what shared space is, but I'm going to show you this little picture right here. This is not an English shared space intersection. This is what I would consider a pure shared space project, and it's in the Netherlands. But what it consists of, a shared space project, is basically, a lot of people call it a naked street. So you remove all those elements that indicate that this is a vehicle-centric space. You remove the curbs, you remove the lane striping, you remove the traffic control devices, and you make it into a plaza. You try to integrate site furnishings, you try to integrate landscaping, you try to humanize it. You make it one level. Often it has textured, patterned pavers, which go from building face to building face, and often some geometric designs like you can see here, which sort of help people navigate and break up the space. Just think old world plazas is sort of the goal. And so why people are interested in this and what the point is of these shared space projects is, at heart, it's a traffic calming. It's a humanization of space. It's a taking back of the road from the cars and opening it up to the general population, to all modes. The idea is that all users, no matter the mode, have equal priority, are welcome to use these spaces. At the same time, by making them ambiguous this way, there's that increased perception of risk. And this is what slows drivers down, lets them know they're in a different area, and makes them ideally communicate and negotiate with other users in the space in order to navigate through the space. Now, one of the things that principles behind shared space likes to push or believe is that by making these spaces more democratic and open, you're sort of balancing a couple of things, right? You're balancing that increased perception of risk, and it's going to be scarier for all users, not just drivers, right? So it's going to be scarier for cyclists, it's going to be scarier for pedestrians. But at the same time, it's supposed to be more freeing. So the idea is that vulnerable users will be able to cross and navigate these spaces a little more freely, not constrained by sidewalks or traffic lanes, but if they want to cut it across like it's a plaza or a square, they can do that. That's what the principle behind shared space posits. So I became interested in this more than 10 years ago. This is actually literally the first article I read on this in the New York Times. I think it was just starting to get out into the popular literature. And I was working in landscape architecture. That's my background, and I ride bikes. I was doing a lot of bike riding. And I saw this, and it just completely hooked me. And 10 years later, this is where I am, looking at shared space still. But when you look at the actual research that's been done on it, there's not a lot out there. It's a relatively new concept in general. Started in the Netherlands, I think, in the late 80s or the 90s. By a traffic engineer named Hans Monderman, who had a very low budget and needed to make a space more safe because children were getting hit. And because he didn't have the money, he started removing elements instead of putting them back in. So what you have when you look at the actual articles in the media, and in the gray literature and journal articles, you have a lot of really general articles out there. They talk about the background of shared space. They talk about a lot of the typical showcase projects, one of which I actually studied, so many of you probably will have seen it. And they talk about the designers and the reasons for it and the concepts behind it and so on. And then you get into the vulnerable user literature, which is significantly less. So you have the pedestrian-specific literature. And then in England, there's a real emphasis in the literature on visually impaired users and how they navigate the spaces, as well as a segment of literature looking at how guide dogs navigate the spaces. There's a lot of concern, and there's even a short film out now by a group that's very adamantly opposed to shared space intersections. And then you get to my little neck of the woods, right over here. There's my mouse. Bike specific. There's one research project that's been done in England and London on Exhibition Road, where all the museums are. That's been converted into a shared space. And then there's a little mention of it in a Danish project as well. And then me. All right, some path information, some definitions. So I'm looking at paths. This is a different scale. I'm not looking at routes. So what we typically look at is how people get to a certain place, the roads they choose, the intersections they avoid, bike paths, et cetera, that they take. I'm literally looking at the intersection itself. I don't care how they got there. I'm just looking at how they navigate in the intersection. So you can see here, we have everybody starting right here. This is Poynton. And everybody ending right here. Remember, they're on the other side of the road. And we have Cyclist A, and these are all paths that I've actually observed. Cyclist A riding in a vehicular manner through this double roundabout. Okay? Then we have Cyclist B staying up, skirting the edge up on the sidewalk, through the crosswalk, sidewalk, crosswalk, ending up in the same place. And then Cyclist C doing the same thing as B, but doing it on the opposite side, so it's a shorter, more efficient path, but nonetheless avoiding the center of the road itself. Okay? And just to remind you, none of my sites, my shared space sites, are pure. Okay? They're all going to have sidewalks of some sort, and they all had crosswalks. And this is due to community concern over this pretty scary and new type of infrastructure. So people insist on having these things, and this is what the sites end up looking like. All right. Now, in order to evaluate these paths, I break the paths down into nodes, and there's going to be an illustration, a graphic after this to show it even more. But the nodes define the line of the path, so via the XY, when you define the line. And each node happens where there's deviation in the path, so that you can see by the number of nodes how much deviation, how many curves, how much variation is in the path. So it's a unit of measurement. And then what I've done for each path, for each direction, what I call the OD, the origin destination. So if someone's going from the north to the south, I've calculated or created an ideal path. It is not the most direct, but it's the most realistic, the most efficient. And then I take the difference between the two. And that is one of my primary variables. And this is what it looks like. Okay, so this is actually one of the sites. This is Coventry without the site plan. You'll see it again. But, so you can see, this is the cyclist path. The cyclist actually goes all the way out of their way and hits the crosswalk and then goes back. But this cyclist path is made up of 9 nodes. So every time there's a variation, in order to keep that line, to be able to draw that line out, I have a node. Whereas what I calculated as the ideal is this right here is 4. So you get a difference of 5. So you can see that the more deviation there is in the path, the greater the difference between the ideal. So stepping back a little bit, some of my research questions. I wanted to understand how cyclists actually navigated and rode through these sites. And was it actually going to be any different from site to site or from non-shared or to control sites, non-treatment? And do the designs or any of the elements actually influence the paths that the cyclists take? This is one of my sites. This is Elwick Square, a shared site. And you can see the textured paving, and you can see it's just wide open. But there's also benches and street trees and things like that there at the other end. I'll have more pictures of all of these. So I hypothesized that there actually wouldn't be any significant differences between the paths chosen because people are used to riding the way they are, or they have specific concerns, and they ride the reasons they do, right? And then I also speculated that there is going to be more variation in a more complicated site. I mean, remember, the goal of these shared space projects is to have people to be very efficient and free to ride where they want to, but I'm hypothesizing that that's not going to happen, is what I was figuring, that people aren't going to necessarily do a straight shot right through the center. So instead, they're going to navigate in a more complicated manner. This is Poynton again with the double roundabout, and you can see some of the paving patterns that they have in the rain. So in order to figure out what I'm watching, who I'm looking at, I had to make some assumptions. And I'm going to assume, or I assumed rather, that even if a cyclist is really intimidated by a space, there's still at least some of them going to ride through it. So I'm going to see, I was assuming that I would have seen a large range of cyclists' skill and confidence levels. Not everybody who's scared of the intersection is going to avoid it. So I'm assuming I'm seeing a diversity of uses. I'm also assuming that the path that a cyclist takes actually reflects their perception of the site, right? So if there's something that's really concerning to them, they're going to avoid it. If they're a very confident or skillful cyclist, they're going to ride differently. And then each cyclist is counted separately. So each trip stands on its own. So even if if I saw the same cyclist more than once, which I would do sometimes, beginning of the day, end of the day, each cyclist trip stands on its own. So I had 6 sites. I'm not going to talk about all of them today. I had shared and controlled, or non-treatment sites, in 3 different towns. And I did video observations. I camped out at these sites, spent at least 3 days at each site, in the morning and the afternoon, just watching, babysitting my GoPro. And I only filmed on good weather days. I only got rained out 1 day, which was great for England in June. Not complaining, so that was pretty good. And this is one of my control sites that's currently undergoing construction, just to give you an idea of some of the settings. Okay, like I said, I used a GoPro and a 12-foot tripod, because to get permission and to get the funding to actually put video cameras up on light posts and really high up so I could really capture everything was beyond what I could do from overseas, as well as what I could afford. And the hoops I would have to jump through in each town were just out of control. So I carried a 12-foot tripod with me. Okay, England. My first study sites were shared down here. Each town has a shared and a controlled. This is in Ashford. It's a commuter suburb of London. Then I went up here to Coventry. It's a bigger city. They used to make Jaguars and everything there. It's just outside of Birmingham. And then up here to Poynton, a smaller town. But this is the one where one of those model projects is, with the double roundabout. Didn't work. There we go. Okay, an aerial of Coventry. This site was really heavy on transit and pedestrian use. This site, the Coventry Control, the city actually specifically asked me to look at this one because this is in the process of being converted to a shared space. So it was a very traditionally signalized, heavy transit use site. I keep wanting to use the keyboard to switch instead of the mouse. This little guy. So some of the elements that we're looking at. This was the only site I had that had a bike lane and a bike box, or advanced stop line, in one direction. Pretty big sidewalk area, a couple of benches scattered, some railing here to keep people from popping out into the road, pedestrians and cyclists. There's a covered walkway here that led to a very large shopping area, pedestrian mall, and then crosswalks and sidewalks all the way around. All right, and then we have some video of how all these sites actually work. So, Coventry Control. So you can see we've got this cyclist here. He's riding in the road. And if you look up here, you've got this guy who's riding on the sidewalk. And he's going to cut over here to the crosswalk here in a second. So he's avoiding the center of the road. See him up there. Okay? And then Again, another person riding on the sidewalk up into the crosswalk and across the road. And you'll start to get an impression of the transit that's going through here. Lots of double-decker buses. I've never seen so many double-decker buses in one place as I did at this intersection. Yes. Signalized. Traditionally signalized intersection. So that's the Coventry site. The shared site in Coventry, just down the road, is on the university campus. And this is the simplest of all the sites. So you can see it's pretty small. And this is a pub, a very popular pub that was right here. And it does not have textured pavers in the intersection, but it has colored asphalt. And this is, I forgot to mention, I observed 490 paths in this intersection. So it was the busiest bicycle intersection of the ones I had. Looking at the elements, again, as all of them, they all have crosswalks. And they use giant stone balls as bollards. And to keep, I assume, cars from cutting up into these areas. And a couple of bike racks, but no benches or anything like that. And this guy in action. So you get this woman. She's ridden up from the crosswalk up onto the sidewalk and back down onto the crosswalk over here. And then this guy is riding on the sidewalk as well. Then I lose track of him because the bus blocks it. You get another cyclist skirting the building edge and the sidewalk up there. And again, more sidewalks. These two are actually in the road. And then this guy's riding without any hands right through the intersection. And this person's riding on the sidewalk. And the woman right next to him is actually riding in the road. So they all have curbs of some sort, but these curbs are all only about this big. So you do get to see people hopping on and off the curbs as well. And then this cyclist riding in a more vehicular manner. Elwick, this was the London suburb. This is the entrance to a large shopping mall, and all the commercial area of the street is right here. This one had a bike path, a shared use path actually connecting it. There's a bridge over the railroad tracks, and the railroad station is just down the road. Again, elements. This had probably the best integrated landscaping and site furniture of any of them. You had a nice seat wall here, benches, trees, but again, integrated crosswalks, some sidewalks, again, the bicycle path. Elwick. Get this, this cyclist way up there. He's skirting the edge. He was on the sidewalk, and this guy's riding right through the center, as one would hope, according to the theory, concept. There he is. He's going to ride up onto the sidewalk. You get these guys riding straight across. There were a lot of BMX riders at this site, actually. This person came up from the bike path behind and is stopping and then going through. Same with this person. Finally, the doozy of them all, Poynton. Get a good look at the double roundabout here. This is by far the most complicated of any of the sites I had. This is a really busy commercial truck route. They're actually building a bypass road, but it's not going to be done for another 5 years or something because they get an enormous amount of large truck traffic, which is the reason they put this whole intersection in this way to begin with. So, again, like they all have marked crosswalks. They had some benches scattered, but nobody ever really used them. And then this stretch goes into the village itself, and it was all shared. It was all traffic calmed as well. All right. Poynton, my favorite. I love this one. So you get this first guy riding on the sidewalk, and you're going to get a feeling for the truck traffic that goes through it. You can see this guy riding up here. He's riding in the road. You guys see him? There he is. The yielding in general for all of these is actually pretty impressive. I was surprised. So I collected a bunch of different variables with respect to each path. I looked at helmet use, I looked at gender when I could identify it, I looked at bike type when I could identify it, and then I looked at the behaviors, the ways that the paths were taken, ridden, whether they rode on the sidewalk or in the crosswalk, if they used the curbs. What was interesting is there were a bunch of people that walked a portion of their path. So they rode through part of the intersection, got off, walked their bike for a bit, got back on their bike and rode away. A bunch of people actually also had walking companions, so they'd be on their bike riding, but they'd have a friend walking next to them. And then, as I've talked about already, the number of nodes and such. I did it all by hand. But everything was done on a to-scale grid, and then so I have XY coordinates for each point on the line. And then they're overlaid onto site plans. So you can see the actual patterns of movement all in one direction. And you can see how people move out of the way and ride up into the crosswalks or actually ride on the road. So looking at some of the sites, we'll look at just crosswalk and sidewalk use for a minute here. Ignoring these two guys, so I'm not really going to talk about them today. If you look at the Coventry controlled, that one control intersection I showed you, and then the other three shared, you see that there's a lot of sidewalk use. As high as 88% up in Elwick Square, really high. And even Coventry, the smallest one, has more than 40% of the people riding on the sidewalk for at least one portion of their trip through the intersection. And you also see a fair amount of crosswalk use as well. They're not necessarily related, right? So what happens here is you also get they're independent of sidewalk use. You get people riding laterally to hit the crosswalk and then ride out. And then you get some people, what I classified as veering. So they are riding in the road, and then they move laterally towards the crosswalk, but they don't actually hit the crosswalk, and then they move back out. So I saw some of that, enough of it to make it count. Then when doing some regression analyses, I was looking at what directions had connections or associations on what paths, right, and the number of nodes. And so you can see, I'm not going to try to confuse anyone on this, but you can see what this is showing here is this is all with respect to the ideal, okay? So the greater the node difference, the farther, the more deviation there was from the ideal. So that means there was more deviation in the path, right? Or in some situations, it's negative, which means that the path I chose as the ideal was actually less efficient than the path a lot of people were taking. Okay, so for instance, this one, this northwest to southwest, is negative because what happens is you get these people, but then you get these people as well. And they're actually doing a shorter, more efficient path than what I had chosen because I didn't choose any ideal paths on the sidewalk, right? And this is the control site. And then again, you've got this one northeast to southwest. Where did it go? Northeast to southwest. Here we go. Pretty high number of nodes. And this is because you've got three different path types going on here. Okay, they're going from here to here. You've got sidewalk to crosswalk and then to sidewalk, spreading out into this more plaza-like space. These are actually riding on the road, and then these are riding on the sidewalk again. Similar idea here in Coventry. This is the one I showed you earlier. You can see how big the variation in nodes is here because you get some people who really go out of their way to avoid the road. Really go out of their way. Actually, technically, they're going this way. So there's sidewalk all the way over to the crosswalk and then all the way over to the crosswalk again. And then similar on this side versus going straight through the intersection. And these guys, again, you see two different types of path choices. So Elwick, the shared, I think this is really interesting. This is the one that had the really well integrated site furnishings, and you get a real spread out selection of path choices that people have made. This is very, very close to what I considered the ideal, almost negligible, south to northwest. So these people are doing pretty much the same thing, whereas these is significantly bigger, but you can just see the enormous variation in the selected paths. And then Poynton, again, you see it each time. And these are the ones that had the biggest amount of variation in the path choices, right? Almost 8 compared to the ideal. And again, 3 different types. You just see all these people who are really doing their best to avoid riding anywhere near the cars. So what I'm finding, what I've found when you watch the video and look at all these illustrations, these graphics, is that the cyclists, when at all possible, are going to use the edges of the sites, okay? And if there's a crosswalk there, they use it. A lot of them do. And that's in both the shared and the control spaces. And in some situations, depending on the site and depending on the element, which is vague, I know, the elements do play a role. For instance, this point right here in Elwick was probably the most important element of any of the sites. People would stop here. People would rest and wait for a break in traffic. People would meet people here. BMX riders would jump on and off of it. It was a place to aim for, and it was a place to just stop and check things out and decide when you wanted to go or not. It was the pivot point for the entire site. The seating areas in here also were really busy, as were the crosswalks. When I started this, I've always sort of thought of a crosswalk as being just a connector between 2 bits of sidewalk across the road. But I'm thinking of it in these situations now as more of, I call it as a pressure relief zone. It allows people to move laterally away from motor vehicles, okay? It's viewed as a safe spot, I think, for a lot of people. This is my interpretation of it. And so even if they're not riding on the sidewalk, you've got a lot of people who are veering towards the crosswalk. And it's that lateral movement, I think, which is showing the cyclists just trying to, they don't want to ride with the motor vehicles. And that shows up in increased deviation and increased number of nodes. It's just the idea of a crosswalk and that lateral space being a safe zone. So to touch back on those hypotheses, I didn't find any real significant differences with respect to crosswalks and sidewalks in between the control spaces and the shared spaces. So the control sites, they use the sidewalk, they use the crosswalk. In the shared spaces, they use the sidewalks, they use the crosswalks. And the more complex a site, the more deviation there was in the path. People were not, for the most part, riding right through in a really efficient way. They were skirting or acting in a very vehicular type manner. They were riding as though they were cars. So they're either riding on the edges or riding as if they were cars. And so the more complex the site, the more bends in the path. I think what these show is that the bicycle is obviously a really flexible and versatile tool. And when the space is there, people are going to choose to ride in it if it makes them comfortable. And I think a lot of people need that lateral space on the edges to be able to feel comfortable enough to ride through these intersections. Not everybody, obviously. I mean, you get a whole bunch of people who are more than happy to ride right through the middle, right? But then you get a whole bunch of people who are, there's no way they're going to ride through the middle of that space. They're going to do everything they can to avoid it. And this was actually a really small, simple intersection that wasn't very big with respect to car traffic. Just, to me, this is showing that when you go back to the concept of shared space and the idea that people are going to have that freedom to navigate spaces as though it was a plaza, this is showing that most people aren't doing that. So what I would take from this when you look at how to apply this to practice or policy, people want that space outside of the line of traffic. They don't want to be riding. A lot of people don't want to be riding with those motor vehicles. And it's the same here as it is in England. That's why we have all this, keep pushing for the separation of modes. So when you're designing these spaces, you need to make that pressure relief zone. You need to allow for that lateral movement. The tighter the space, the more conflict there potentially is, the tighter everything is in there, and probably the more stressed the riders are. But in general, if you integrate certain elements and humanize the space, like those benches and trees and things, it's a more welcoming intersection, and people ride a greater diversity of paths, and they're more spread out, and you get more people doing that straight through the intersection. But in general, I found it to be a very effective form of traffic calming. There was a lot of very good yielding. I saw conflict was hard to count per se, but I saw very little conflict. I saw one cyclist hit a pedestrian because the pedestrian was on her phone running across the crosswalk to catch a bus and walked right into a cyclist path, and there were words exchanged. And then I saw one left hook, which would be like a right hook here. And that's it. Over a month of observations. And that includes the control site. That was it. There was very little danger involved that I could see. And I want to thank NHTSA for helping pay for this, and look forward to any questions. Thank you. Yeah. Li-Ming, were you going to monitor, or should I just call on people? Okay.
Auto civil engineering. What are the regulations, what are the bike regulations in England? Are bicyclists allowed to ride on the sidewalk?
That's a good question. One of the other things I did that I didn't talk about in this is I did an online survey for each of these sites, right? Each site had its own survey. According to the highway code, they are not allowed to be riding on the sidewalk, okay? They call it the pavement. And so this was actually fascinating. I asked about that. I asked about path choices and preferences. And the only people that actually answered my surveys were very experienced, passionate cyclists. And I got lectured on each answer about the highway code and how it was illegal to do any of the riding that I showed, right? I showed all these. This would all be illegal. And I was informed that many a time. So one of the questions that arises, you get this population who would probably never ride on the sidewalk. Do you have to change the code? Because obviously people are doing it, right? But yes, the code, according to England's highway code, says that's not legal.
Does it follow into that? Did you look at the correlation, or is there a correlation between people who ride on the sidewalk, and I guess regulations, bike codes, to the paths that you observe?
That's hard to. Yeah, I haven't. It's really hard to make that connection, right? Because the only way I was able to do that. The people that answered my surveys were very aware of the highway code. But that surveys because I didn't want to modify the paths that people were taking, and I didn't have the money or the time to stay longer to do additional days to do that. So I'd like to do more of that in the future, but I can't tell you if there's any connection there or not. Yeah.
So, I'm a senior at PSU. So what time frames did you choose to take your observations at? And did you notice a change in the deviation of your measurements as you moved from either in the morning early to late morning, or in the evening from early evening to late evening? Does that make sense?
That's a good question. I never thought about that, actually. Looking at the amount of deviation with, like, wanting to get home and being more of a fatigue.
That I noticed is, like, in Portland, commuters leave, like, bike commuters usually leave early, and leisure bicycle users usually are later, and the people who commute by bicycle are like straight and direct, and people who are on leisure trips are like all over the sidewalk and stuff.
That's always a hard one to say. I did try to get the morning rush and the afternoon rush, and I would stop my filming when there was really large gaps of time between seeing anybody on the bicycle. So I had enough backup batteries on my GoPro to keep changing, and then when you'd sort of get this traditional peak, right? You'd get all these cyclists, and then, and I'd be sitting there for 10, 15 minutes, not see anybody. I had 2 sites that were almost strictly recreational, though. And those are 2 of the sites I didn't talk about. And they did not have the deviation. They did not have any sidewalk riding. They did not have any crosswalk riding. Yeah, so, but those are completely different than these other 4 sites. Does that answer? Mostly.
Hi, my name is Tom. I'm a 4th-year student at Community Development. And I guess the question I have is level of service. Does England or Great Britain have like level of service for pedestrians and cyclists as well as vehicles, motor vehicles? And is that something you address in this study to see how that was affected with these intersections?
They have regular level of service, and I know there has been discussion about bicycle-related level of service, and similar to us, a lot of pushback against level of service for vulnerable, for different non-motorized modes. I did not specifically look at level of service with respect to any of this. I did do average vehicle counts, so I can tell you in general, only with respect to the vehicle traffic, and then of course you have all my numbers with respect to the cyclist observations. This was a very quiet site. The Poynton double roundabout was the busiest site by almost 4 times, car traffic-wise, compared to any of the others. So no, I didn't really look at level of service specifically.
Curtis Fisher, I'm in the urban planning section. What takeaways or what lessons did you learn from this that could be applicable to a typical U.S. intersection?
Good question. It performed better than I thought, the shared space, as far as actually being a legitimate form of traffic calming. But it wasn't the miracle that I think a lot of people think it should be. And I'm not sure if that's a time thing or if that's a culture thing. But there wasn't anything to be scared of. I think they worked in general really well. It's hard to say with respect to the U.S., all of these had crosswalks and all of these had sidewalks, right? So none of them were really pure. They're probably a little more close to what we're gradually working towards these things. Like there's a couple of projects in the U.S. that don't actually have intersections because, of course, that's the site for the most conflict. They only have straightaways. But for me, I think the takeaway is that I think it's worth trying. I'd really like to see more demonstration-type projects in, but I think it's going to require time and education to get people to use them and understand what they're looking at. Sort of a general, does that make sense? Did that answer that?
Justin Griffith, Civil Engineering. Just kind of wondering about, the behavior you said, like a lot of the cyclists either stayed on sidewalks or rode as though they were vehicles, and that's kind of like you would do in almost any intersection anywhere. And so I had a couple of kind of questions about that. I'm wondering, one, and maybe you touched on this, I don't remember, I'm wondering how long these shared spaces have been there, so whether or not people have gotten used to them and like adapted or changed their behavior. And then if you think, if the approaches are not shared in a similar way and people are used to riding, in a separate path or in the road, is the change in intersection going to change their behavior, or are they going to just kind of continue in the same mode they've been riding? Whatever your thoughts are.
Bingo. That's a big part of it. They've all been on the ground for at least a couple of years, so none of them are brand new. So you have to ask, of course, is it just habit? It's a good question. I mean, I couldn't tease that out because my surveys were just inadequate. Is it the highway code? dictating still for some of those people. Yeah, I mean, that's hard to say. I mean, I think you need a cultural shift in some ways, and maybe it's just needs to be accompanied by a change in the highway code as well as more education. But no, it's not. I'm not seeing it really have that effect that one would expect. They've all been in the ground at least 2 years. Sorry.
Greatly Stark in the work program. One of the first sites, I think it was a control site that you showed. You said that they were excited that you were going to look at the intersection because they were planning improvements. And I'm curious what if they did use your data, or like what if they're going from a typical intersection, are they going to make it into a shared space, and like what sort of improvements they're doing there?
They already had the design done when I got there. So we talked about it. They know roughly. They haven't seen everything final, but they know roughly what I have found. But the design was already pretty much done. The entire center of Coventry within the ring road is all being calmed. So they're basically transitioning the entire center of Coventry into a giant shared space project, roughly. No traffic signs, no lane markings anywhere in the center of Coventry. So yes, it was going to be converted. The one with all the buses is going to be converted into a shared space, and it's in the process of doing that right now. They're completely into that right now.
There are any significant or noticeable differences between regular roundabouts and shared spaces in regards to bicycle traffic?
In general, regular roundabouts are probably the most dangerous infrastructure form for cyclists. These seem calmer. I mean, the yielding rate on these, and I don't know if you're talking because of just the focus on the way a traditional roundabout is designed with the curbs and all the signs and the slip lanes and all of that. I think this one is different because it's so confusing. It's not really easy to see when you're in the middle of it, and those big trucks take up so much space as well. They're blocking some of those paths, and it's just a really complicated site to drive through. And I think that's what's having the impact. It's a double roundabout, but it's a completely flat one, right? So it's like a virtual roundabout. Does that make sense?
Would you recommend using shared spaces as opposed to roundabouts in the U.S. or even in Japan?
It works. I mean, it depends on what your goals are. It definitely works. The traffic before in this intersection, the congestion was enormous. And it took forever for pedestrians to get across, and it took forever for cyclists to get across. And it's much better this way now. But it's still nonstop traffic, and it's still pretty intimidating. I'd like to see them happen more. I'd like to see us start to try them. So, yeah.
So my take on shared spaces is that you get a lower speed and that there's some ambiguity about paths taken, so you have to be
On your toes.
on your toes. And I'm wondering if, like the Coventry shared space, which to me looks a lot like a regular uncontrolled intersection, if the out-of-direction travel, if the amount of out-of-direction travel is really related to how much it looks like an uncontrolled intersection. You know, are they reacting to the fact that, oh, this isn't as much a shared space as it is an intersection, so I'm going to do the crosswalk thing, whereas something like double roundabout, they might be a little, well, that has a lot of traffic.
Yeah.
So I'm wondering if that reflects their wariness of how shared it is or not.
Good question. I mean, this one's also skewed. This is a small site. So in some ways, I think the skewing of it contributes to the lateral movement. But you also do distinctly see a lot of people riding up the road through the curb cut all the way up to to hit the crosswalk. So I think you're seeing some people go significantly more out of the way than they needed to. And then if they wanted to treat it, I mean, it's a fine line on that. I'm not really sure how to answer that, right? Until I could actually ask people, it's hard to say what the reasons are behind it. But I am seeing more deviation than there needed to be, is what I'm getting at.
I'm just wondering if that's because, did you know how much the speed got reduced at each of these places from the approaches?
Quite a bit. I mean, this is a fair ways into the ring road, and it's all pretty calm. It's all probably about 20. So this whole section is already very quiet. You're on the university campus, and this is actually a pretty quiet intersection with respect to vehicles as compared to the other ones. So there's not much speeding in here at all. Everyone's pretty slow. This one, the Poynton one, again, not much speeding, but pretty overwhelming with respect to the amount of traffic, especially the trucks. So I understand why a lot of people are like, nope, not going anywhere near that thing.
Mary Weiser, Civil Engineering. Did you yourself ride through each of these?
I did not get a chance to. I didn't get to rent a bike, so no. I walked through all of them and did the pedestrian. Actually, the Elwick Square one for me was the hardest one to get across. The big one as a pedestrian. But this one, the Poynton one, I had no problems. The yield rate on that was actually pretty impressive. Because these trucks are all going actually pretty slowly. The only time it was an issue with respect to speed for any of them, especially this one, is when it was almost completely empty. So when there isn't a lot of traffic in them, that's when people were speeding up. Sorry, I'm not sure.
So when I think about shared spaces, I picture a lot of people and bikes going through, like maybe even majority of the traffic. But in these sites, it's definitely was like a high amount of traffic, and so I'm curious, like how these shared spaces could be improved to actually make it more comfortable for people to walk and bike, and to increase the levels of that instead of people driving through them. Like what could be different?
It's a good question. With respect to the Poynton one, I think it's going to help a lot once the bypass road and all the big trucks are taken out. I think part of the other problems with these, and this is speculating, is that they're not as integrated into the surroundings as they could be. I'd like to see more things like more trees. I'd like to see more benches. I'd like to see it more humanized. I think the patterns are great. I think the textured paving and all of that and just the sheer ambiguity is great. But like this doesn't have any place to hang out besides the pub right up there. So I think you need to they need to be made more human. Yeah. I'm trying to think. Did that sort of answer? They all have a lot more. I mean, when the shared space concept came out, they were always suggested for pretty low traffic areas. And this Poynton one was getting 2,000 plus cars an hour on average, including those trucks. It's a busy site, and it works really well. I mean, it's really bizarre. It's really hard to navigate, but it works really well. So I think the busier ones, like I was saying, with respect to traffic speed, actually work better than the less busy ones. Yeah. Yes?
Jorge Gonzalez, Civil Engineering. When you were out there observing, how often did you notice any conflicts between bicyclists, pedestrians, or vehicles? And additionally, what in general is like the yielding hierarchy that you observe?
Very little blatant conflict. Single digits for each site over a 3-day period. I saw just that one collision. I saw some avoidance behaviors, so I'd see a cyclist or a pedestrian try to maneuver around somebody, so a change in path with respect to that. But actual conflict rate that I could see, and it's really hard to see it all, right, from the video, that I could see was fewer than 10 per site. And the yielding, the pedestrians were, in general, actually yielded to quite well. And, I mean, if you're in the road traveling vehicularly, you don't have to worry about that, right, if you're looking for the cars to yield to you. This one, there's a big yield spot right here, and this was a bit tricky with respect to vehicles yielding to vehicles, because you've got people coming in this way and you've got people coming in this way. So that was probably the only sort of touch-and-go spot. Buses yielded really well, in general, to everybody in the other sites that I saw, including the control site. And I didn't see any really crazy maneuvers by anybody.
I was curious about one of the signs in your slides that said equal priority, whereas legally, at least in the States, pedestrians have priority over the vehicles. And so I'm wondering did they truly mean equal priority, or did they really mean expect everybody to be...
My understanding is their law is very similar to ours. My understanding is they expect everybody, expect everything. You know, you have to yield to everybody, everybody has to yield, yeah. Free access to everybody is the way my understanding is it needs to be interpreted. So, yeah. And that's one of the things they suggest for all shared space projects is to have those gateways to let people know when they're coming in and going out. The change in paving, the signs, the entry monuments. So.
I suppose I'm not an expert on shared space. My understanding is that shared space is supposedly is for the intersection that pedestrians, cyclists, and car has kind of equal, as you mentioned. So what's the point of have a sidewalk marked at those intersections?
That's exactly right. These projects all have sidewalks and crosswalks because when you do the actual community participation, the development and the concept stage of any of these projects, all of the communities were concerned enough about bringing something like this in that they always insisted on having them included. There was another project I read about where they just kept pushing and pushing and pushing for a bike lane to be integrated into it, which even still defeats the entire purpose. So the big question is, would there be any difference when there were no sidewalks and no crosswalks whatsoever? But because of community concerns, they all have sidewalks and they all have crosswalks. That's why. Yeah, they couldn't convince anybody not to have them put in.
You want to provide equality to the bicycle drivers and just sidewalk. But from your conclusion, the bicycle driver wants space to avoid the vehicle, and here you mentioned the presence of a larger sidewalk or additional plant area, expanded readable area. So my question is, do you prefer to separate a specific lane for the bicycle riders, or maybe this is safer to both the bicycle rider and the people just walk on the sidewalk. So this, I think, is one kind of equality.
Right. So I think, how to answer this? I think if you completely segregate again, you're getting back to where you were, right, by having a specific bike lane and sidewalk. Whereas if you just provide the space without breaking it up, you let people choose according to their comfort level, and you retain the ambiguity of the intersection. Whereas if you start dividing it again, I think you revert it back to a more traditional intersection. So you let those people who want to ride where they want to ride wherever they want. And you let those people who are too timid or too concerned, you give them that space without telling them you must ride here. This type of space lets them choose where they want to ride instead of dictating where they want to ride. Does that make sense?
And I think the traffic of the vehicle traffic and the bicycle traffic is not very deep here in the several sites. But for the public safety, for example, in Shanghai, then there are specific bicycle lane in the main street. So even there are very large space of the sidewalk or in the plaza area, the bicycle riders just go on the bicycle lane. They don't invade the area of the plaza. So it's a very safety user. It's a very busy population and heavy traffic. Not only the vehicle traffic, but the bicycle traffic in Shanghai, especially the rush hour. So if you don't separate the bicycle lane, it's not safe for the for the people walk on the sidewalk. So I think maybe we haven't any time to wait for the bicycle riders that they can change their riding habits, and we can't wait until they change themselves, I think.
I would also, yes, I see what you're saying. And remember, these are all site-specific. You can't put a shared space intersection or treatment just anywhere. I mean, you do have to look at the site itself and the surrounding uses, as well as the amount of traffic, pedestrian traffic, cycling traffic, and vehicle traffic, to determine whether you can put them there or not. So, for instance, the Poynton one is higher amount of traffic than most places are, but I don't think some of the Shanghai situations you're talking about would necessarily be appropriate for something like this. Yeah, I'm not saying blanket, put them everywhere. I think where you're looking at some mixed-use commercial, lots of pedestrian traffic, reasonable amounts of car traffic, you've got to have all the uses, you've got to tick all the boxes before you can really consider something like this.
Portland location that you would try this out?
Oh, there's so many. I put them around Pioneer, for one. I think all of the South Auditorium stretch, that whole pedestrian walkway stretch that goes all the way, I'd put them all the way down that, all the roads crossing there. I'd put them down Alberta. I'd put them down Mississippi. Yeah, any of those busy commercial, heavy pedestrian, I'd put them in all of those places. I'd love to see tests on things like that.